It's Christopher Nolan's final stab at Batman as he provides a clean ending to one of the best trilogies of all time. This is The Dark Knight Rises.
Can you see by the dawn's early
You
light
are as precious to me as you were to your own mother and father. I swore to them that I would protect you, and I haven't.
the twilight's last gleam?
The mayor's gonna dump him in the spring.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
But he's a hero.
A war hero. This is peacetime.
You think this can last? There's a storm coming, Mr. Wayne. You and your friends better batten down the hatches. Because when it hits, you're all gonna wonder how you ever thought you could live so large and leave so little for the rest of us.
What does that mean?
Right.
This is the Superhero Pantheon. On this podcast, we take one superhero film a week and decide whether it should be in the Pantheon, the Pile of Shame, or somewhere in between. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5-star review so as to help people discover the show and the great work that the folks at the real world are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so in two ways. First, send an email to superheropantheon@gmail.com. Second, find us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian DeBrain. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. And tonight, Brian, we are going to be going over a bit of a maligned movie. It is The Dark Knight Rises, of course. And while this movie does have an incredible box office number and a high IMDb score and a high Rotten Tomato score, I think that where people have kind of come down on this movie in a way is that it is not as good as Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, and it is certainly not in both of those cases. I don't think it's nearly as good. But I know that on my rewatch, I found that I really enjoyed a lot of the movie. I definitely had certain problems with the story, but in the end, I found myself wholly satisfied with this experience. And as a conclusion to a trilogy, I ultimately felt like this worked.
I think what a lot of people don't like about this movie is the 8 year gap. And I know people are like, Batman would never hang up the cape and cowl for 8 years and just give up. Well, it's not necessarily he gave up, right? Him and Gordon just kind of felt that they won the war at the end. Even though I kind of felt Joker won the war at the end of The Dark Knight, but that's a whole different debate. But they felt like they won. So in that case, he felt like he was done and he didn't have to do it anymore. And deep down, he kind of wanted to come back, I guess, and that's kind of what Alfred was kind of alluding to in his dialogue with him the whole time. Like you kind of wanted this, and I think deep down you want to die in the cape and cowl, and that's kind of like what pretty much happened at the end. But I think that's where people kind of get upset is this whole idea that he gave up for 8 years, and not necessarily he gave up, but this idea that he would just kind of go away and then at the end kind of just retire. Like that's something when Batman wouldn't do. But in this case, in this universe, after all the shit that this guy's been through physically, emotionally, like he deserves to just retire. And I'm glad they gave him that ending because Batman never gets a happy ending and he got one here. So that I thought that was really cool of them to do that.
One of the things that I am ultimately really happy they made the decision to do was to complete this trilogy, and this is probably something that will never be touched again, either by Christopher Nolan or by any other director. And Nolan is not the type of person who's going to construct an MCU or even do television, I think. He strikes me as the type of person who is pure cinema right from the get-go, and he's the type of person who wants to tell a complete story within each film, and then here at the end of this trilogy kind of complete the circle, so to speak. And what makes this movie such an interesting archive is that in the Avengers, which had come out a couple months earlier, there was this big moment with Iron Man and a nuclear weapon and possibly teasing his death. And then a couple months later, you also had Batman's death being teased, but then they don't deliver on it. And I remember watching the trailers, and I actually was rewatching the trailers as I was cutting the audio earlier on today. Those trailers, which are incredible, by the way, heavily tease that Batman is going to die. And if you look at Christopher Nolan's previous movies up to this point, and I'm going to spoil The Prestige, The Dark Knight, and Inception, all three of those movies, they either had kind of dark, twisty endings like The Prestige. The Prestige, I still think is probably one of the darkest movies that has ever been made by Christopher Nolan as far as how that is all paid off. The Dark Knight has a dark ending with Batman having to run away from dogs, and Jim Gordon's kids are literally being threatened, and it's kind of this very menacing ending. And then Inception ends in a bit of a questionable manner with Cobb turning the top, and we don't know what happens to it. So there's always been kind of this air of mystery to it. But what I think I've ultimately realized about Christopher Nolan when it comes to making Batman movies is he believes in the moral center of Bruce Wayne. And that is very different from what Zack Snyder believes in. And we're going to talk about that in a couple weeks and how he sees Batman and how he sees Superman. But when people think of Christopher Nolan being dark, I think they are absolutely incorrect in their assessment of how he sees Bruce Wayne. He sees Bruce Wayne as an absolute center, and he sees Batman as a symbol. That is who Batman was from the very start. Batman is a person, but he's also a symbol for Gotham. And in this movie, we see Batman ultimately kind of become the hero that is both deserved and needed at the same time.
Yeah, and with Nolan, like that's pretty much what you got to do when interpreting his movies, like, or especially the Batman movies. Like, there's a certain realism that he takes with it. It's not necessarily dark. It's just realistic takes that kind of have like, consequences. You know what I mean? Like, there are consequences to your actions, kind of thing. And I think that he really illustrates that with the Batman series a lot. And this idea that he's gone for 8 years, and realistically, yeah, he would go away for 8 years, and realistically he wouldn't want to kill people still. Like, he still has his morals, and he still has like that moral up until the end. You know what I mean? And that Zack Snyder kind of vision of not giving a fuck and just kind of killing people, and whether or not he was killing people or not, but you can kind of clearly tell that like Nolan has this vision of the Dark Knight that's kind of like like you said, at its core. He's very, he's the knight that the city deserves. So it's really cool that he kind of put this spin on it. And I feel like, you're right that people kind of interpret it as dark, but to me it's more realistic. And realism kind of, I don't know, it just works so well in this universe that that hokey shit that you see kind of in Batman versus Superman doesn't really work in comparison.
Well, I think there's a certain amount of hokiness to some of the dialogue in Christopher Nolan's movies as well. I don't think that these movies are absolutely perfect, and some of the dialogue is clunky, but I think there is a clear effort in every conceivable way to make this world feel real. And in the original treatment for this story, one of the critiques that has been made is about Two-Face as possibly being a principal antagonist here, because really we only saw Two-Face for a good 15 minutes total screen time in the movie. And initially, at the end of The Dark Knight, the Joker would have scarred Harvey Dent at a courtroom trial, setting up the third movie. Dent's death and fall was put in at the end of the second movie instead, so to set up the aftermath that follows. Following the release of this movie, writer, producer, and director Christopher Nolan elaborated on his choice to include the Two-Face story in the prior movie. He wanted each movie to stand on its own as a complete story and not tease any sequels, a practice that had become common amongst comic book movies. Nolan feels that holding back story or leaving a movie open-ended for a sequel on which to build is a key to the audience, which deserves to see a movie that has consumed all of the filmmaker's creative energy. I sort of see his point, but then why did we see the Joker card at the end of Batman Begins? So I'm not. I understand what he's trying to say. I'm not sure if I totally believe it.
Me neither, because that Joker card is really important, and that was a big tease. So I don't know if he just kind of said it on the fly or was just talking out of his ass, but I get what he's trying to say, and this does feel like a complete movie on its own. Like I feel like, especially like the last two, Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises, they're very standalone-ish. You know what I mean? Like you can just show that to any casual moviegoer, and they would like hop onto it. I think that's what happened with Dark Knight, and I think that's kind of what happened with Dark Knight Rises as well, because I know a lot of people still kind of have this like this Bane impersonation. Everyone kind of has like a go-to Bane impersonation just based off that Tom Hardy thing, and that was like what 8 years ago now. So it kind of still sticks with people.
Right. And I think a lot of people wanted Two Face. A lot of people are also curious about whether the Joker was going to be used in this movie. About a year before this movie's release, writer, producer, and director Christopher Nolan mentioned that he was considering using a mixture of CG and deleted scenes from The Dark Knight to have the Joker appear briefly. He ultimately decided it was disrespectful to Heath Ledger. And I think that there is certainly multiple ways that you could deal with this. I know that Carrie Fisher is going to be a part of Star Wars Episode 9 with the family's permission. They have given their blessing to that. I think that there are so many differences. The fact that Carrie Fisher was in multiple Star Wars movies, she is also a protagonist in those films, and the Joker is kind of an antagonist. And I certainly see where Christopher Nolan was coming from. I think unfortunately, his passing kind of put him in a no-win situation. And I ultimately think that for the sake of this movie, I think it was the right call to just not even mention him at all, even though it feels kind of weird, but I do understand where he's coming from, and I think there is the plausibility that he was executed or based on the Dent Act, that he was just murdered flat out. And they don't need to say that. They don't need to mention it. But I would certainly understand why they made the decision that they did.
It would have been way too awkward. And with the circumstances, with everything, it would have been kind of like this kind of weird, kind of haunting thing. I bet a lot of people would have been very upset about it, more so than the Carrie Fisher thing. So, and it kind of fits because this whole idea that we never know the background of the Joker, we never know where he comes from, we don't know what happens to him officially at the end, so it's kind of open ended to your interpretation. So, based on that, hell, we can kind of come up with our own interpretation of what happens to the Joker. You say he got murdered. I say he probably got transferred to some like out of state asylum maybe, and then for all we know he probably did get the death penalty for all we know, but and then he could have got easily murdered in prison as well. But I definitely think he's now no longer in Gotham. I definitely think he's not in Arkham Asylum. Although it was kind of weird seeing the Scarecrow at the end, or not the end, but like probably 2/3 of the movie doing the whole sentencing thing. And I kind of see how that could have been possibly the Joker kind of doing that. But again, it probably doesn't fit his character to do that anyway. But that's kind of the only way I see Joker fitting in is probably when they bust out people from Arkham and the prison. But like I said, like within an 8 year span, they probably transferred him out of state just to be safe.
One of the things that Nolan really likes is his themes. In the first movie, the theme was fear, as we know with the Scarecrow. In The Dark Knight, it was chaos. And in this movie, it is all about pain, as we are seeing the residuals from the first two movies. Even though the first two movies are kind of standalone, and this is to an extent a standalone on its own, we are seeing the results of what has happened in the first two movies. Bruce Wayne dealing with the injuries and the fallout from that. Gotham dealing with the fallout of capitalism in general. The fact that there's the Dent Act also is such a huge part of this movie because it allowed Gotham City to put all of these criminals away and basically end major crime in the city, and it is all based on a lie, and you deal with the pain of that. And ultimately, I guess as the old saying goes, is that there are receipts for all the lies and all the manipulations that you tell, and that is such an important aspect of this movie, and why Bane really was kind of the only villain that I think could have gotten all that across.
Yeah, I love that whole aspect of it. You know what I mean? It's like the whole idea that there's consequences for your actions, and the idea that they felt like they had to cover up Dent's true, like when he killed the five people and blamed it on Batman in order to keep these people in prison, all for naught because 8 years later they all get released anyway. But I think because of their actions during the riot and the terrorist takeover, they probably went back to jail anyway. So but the Dent Act is, they really emphasize that, and they kind of make this kind of political thing. And it sort of feels like The Wire for like the first 10, 15 minutes, like the fifth season of The Wire, where it gets all political and stuff, or was it the fourth season? But I thought that was kind of like weird. Not weird, but weird in a way where they had, the guy who played Carcetti, the guy from Game of Thrones, Littlefinger, also for like a 5 minute cameo at the beginning. So I thought that was kind of weird that I had that kind of vibe as well. But the whole thing with the beginning, and they're talking about the politics of everything, and it's no longer a wartime, it's peacetime, and Gordon's on the way out, and blah blah blah. It just feels like they took everything for granted. These new cops that come in the last 8 years since the Dent Act, and like they're just taking everything for granted because of all the shit that we saw in the previous movie. Like it was pure chaos that the Joker brought, with the crime bosses and everything, and it's such a drastic change. And you can tell by like everyone's kind of has this kind of calm to them right before the storm is coming, and they mentioned the storm coming in this movie as well. So I thought that was kind of cool that there was like this subtle calm before the storm with all these characters taking things for granted, just sipping champagne, peacetime, right? And I like that little detail there. And then everything goes to not chaos again, but basically, they get taken over, like a terrorist takeover, a hostage crisis. They siege the city, and Bane comes in, and it's pretty much great from there as well.
So there are a number of notable aspects of the Bane character. When the trailer was first released, there were some complaints about not being able to hear him all that well. By the time the final product came out, though, I certainly did not have a problem hearing every Tom Hardy line. It was a bit eerie, just the way that it sounded and the way that it echoed. Just tremendous work all the way around. Tom Hardy was a huge Batman fan, and that's one of the things that I think hurt his performance. He said that he felt like I was beating up my childhood hero. However, he also said that despite his worship of the character, the moment Christopher Nolan yelled "Action!" Hardy just started throwing punches as hard as he could. And we could talk about just how visceral the big fight scene with Bane and Batman is towards the middle of this. And the main reason the Bane was chosen by Nolan to be this movie's main antagonist was to test Batman mentally as well as physically, two major characteristics of Bane from the comic series, whereas Bane was nothing, and I mean less than nothing, in Batman and Robin. Here, he is the most important villain, even more so than Miranda Tate, who ultimately is not revealed until the end, and Catwoman is much more of a protagonist than an antagonist in this movie. And just the way that they use sound, the way that they use that very specific soundtrack, it just works out so well. And even the way that they did the sound effects for his footsteps as he was walking, they made it feel very visceral and brute, while Batman was much more stealthy. And those are the things that I really appreciated about the Bane character. And what an apology that they just gave to that character in this movie. I think Tom Hardy does not get the credit that he deserves for this. I don't necessarily know if he deserved an Academy Award for this, but I certainly thought he was very good.
And like very unique, and that whole take on it, and that muffled voice. Like we've never heard a voice like that ever. So I think that adds to the creepiness because it's so weird, and yet you have to get so familiar with it because there's a lot of dialogue coming from his mouth. So you have to like kind of listen in closely. It's very, meticulous and very peculiar and, very specific. And I like that because it's so eerie and creepy every time he talks. You know what I mean? And we also have to mention that Tom Hardy's the kind of guy that, gets, actually, sized up for his role. Like, I haven't seen the movie before, but everyone loved him in this. I think it was called Bronson or something like that. And he put on like probably like 30 or 40 pounds of pure muscle just to look the part, and then lost it again for I think for Inception, and then gained the weight again for Dark Knight Rises. So like he really puts the effort in to look the part, and there's no bullshit. Like you see him physically in this movie, like with his shirt off, that's him because he gained the muscle mass for it. So he got the look for it, he's got the voice for it, and because he's so good at playing these like sly kind of characters, and he's good at like creating these unique kind of characters, that he was able to create this unique voice for Bane, and adding the filter actually adds to the creepiness. So I love that effect. And I know people were probably having trouble with it at first, but that's only because it's something you'd never heard of ever in your life. So it's something that your ears have to adjust to, and that's kind of what happens after the first minute. But once you do, it's like it becomes really creepy and effective.
All right, just a few more notes before we get into actually talking about the categories. Is once again, there's tons of stuff to talk about here. According to Gary Oldman, Christopher Nolan told the actors and actresses the ending of the movie verbally to avoid any leaks, and this is definitely something that has been an issue with these franchises over the course of the last few years. Chloe Grace Moretz and Jennifer Lawrence both auditioned for the role of Jen, Selena Kyle's sidekick. So that is a bit of an interesting note. Also, there is a John Wick connection between this movie and John Wick. The facade of the Gotham Stock Exchange is the same facade used in the John Wick film franchise for the Continental Sanctuary Hotel, which is pretty great. And of course, Christopher Nolan is the first director to complete a full trilogy of Batman movies. This is something that neither Tim Burton nor Joel Schumacher were able to do, but he's just the second person to direct a full trilogy of movies of one superhero, something that Sam Raimi had done previously with the Spider-Man franchise. And what I think is so interesting about this fun fact is that if you look at so many of these superhero trilogies, Jon Favreau did not finish the Iron Man trilogy. The Russos did not direct all of the Avengers movies. Joss Whedon, in fact, is the one who did the first two. So Christopher Nolan is one of the rare people to actually get to finish what he started, so to speak. And it's funny because James Gunn almost didn't get to do it, and he is also going to be added to this list whenever Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 comes out. But whereas I think Sam Raimi had so many problems on Spider-Man 3, and Sony was kind of dictating to him a lot, this is definitely the vision of a singular filmmaker, and it is really obvious that Warner Brothers did not have a lot of say, Brian, because if Warner Brothers did, there would have been some way that they would have tried to extend this universe. But Christopher Nolan very clearly had a lot of power on this movie.
Yeah, and that's a good thing. And I think some of that credit has to do with Inception because I feel like he went on a fucking gamble for that movie. Like he gambled with that for such an original concept for something like Inception and to pay off the way it did and getting a Best Picture nomination and being like box office successful and making so much money and DiCaprio was in the movie. That's a big major player. So to me, like Inception gave him some of that power and control because they felt like, okay, you gave us this original hit, do us another Batman movie, we'll give you full, complete control. And that seems like what happened totally. And like if let's say Inception was like a moderate success and didn't get the Best Picture nomination, all that kind of thing, I really think Dark Knight Rises would have been like a different kind of movie because they wouldn't have given him this much control. But I'm glad they did because he's earned it, and I think the talent kind of rises at the top sometimes, and he's one of those people that he's just so good that you kind of have to give him control. And even with something as like polarizing as Dunkirk, it's still got like all this critical acclaim and Best Picture stuff. So he kind of still knows what he's doing, despite how he writes his female characters, obviously. But he has a lot of power and control that I think he's deserved. And he's kind of got, like I said before, the Stanley Kubrick kind of like quality where he turns like modern blockbuster cinema and just kind of mixes it with art house and kind of creates this unique thing. And he's great at doing that. And I'm glad he had all this power and control because it would have been totally different, and they probably would have shoehorned in like probably the Heath Ledger stuff and all these other things, and thrown the Riddler in here and there. They probably would have fucked it up like they did in the '90s.
Definitely. Let's talk about the heroes. Christian Bale definitely looks older as he dyed part of his hair to make Bruce Wayne look older. And at the beginning of this movie, he is essentially a hermit. And there is even a couple of Howard Hughes jokes made in this movie. But he returns to Batman to become Batman. Basically, the way that it is portrayed is that he is doing this as a suicide mission because from a physical standpoint, he is not what he once was. He is not a young man. It has been 8 years. He was using a cane. He has to use different tools just to get himself back into relative fighting shape. He is not as muscular as he has been in previous movies, but once he loses the battle with Bane and he is sent to the prison, he kind of has to grow both physically and mentally and understand not only how much he cares about Gotham, but about actually just living in general and understanding that just being Batman is not what is going to leave him as a satisfied human being. And we go a pretty long time without seeing him as Batman, and there are even moments when Bruce Wayne is kind of left behind because he's kind of on his own. And I think it's really interesting the way that they portray Bruce Wayne in this movie because he's really not necessarily supposed to be the best person at the beginning of this because he's basically given up on life. But then at the end, he does perhaps the most noble thing of all by becoming a symbol and slipping into retirement.
Yeah, his performance I think was just so amazing because at the beginning of the movie, like he's just the way he sounds. It sounds like been through some shit, and it sounds like Bruce Wayne is like broken. Like it feels like the events from 8 years ago kind of broke his soul, and you can hear it in his voice and the way he talks, and like he's very soft spoken in a way that it's like it's very rattled and it's very coarse. He's been through a lot, and you can hear it in his voice, and I love that aspect of his performance. It's like those little things, you know what I mean? And he carries it throughout, and the way he's just like holding on to himself on a cane. Like the dude's like in his 30s and he needs a cane. Like what does that tell you? The dude was Batman for a year, less than a year. He's already got no cartilage in his knee like Terry Funk. He's in worse shape than most wrestlers, most stuntmen, all from just 1 year being Batman. I can't imagine him being Batman for 8 years. You know what I mean? Like he needed that break, whether his body, I mean, whether his mind was in it or not. Like his body needed that break, and him coming back is just like it's kind of reminds you of like the Undertaker every time he comes back and his body's broken and you don't want him to come back, but he feels like he has to come back. In this case, he kind of had to come back because he realized Bane was this big threat, and it gave him this reason to come back. But then Alfred just calls him out on his shit, and he's like, "You've been wanting a reason to come back. Basically, you want to die in the suit. I know you want to die in the suit, and it hurts me to say, like, to see that you do this, and I don't want to bury you." But he does it anyway, and he finds a way to kind of like make peace with himself at the end by sacrificing himself, quote unquote. But I just love this Bruce Wayne that's kind of just broken down. He's old, but he's young. You know what I mean? Like he's getting too old for this kind of shit, kind of thing. Even though he was only Batman for a year, and it blows my mind how fucked up his body got, and how much he got scarred up, and how much his body didn't even really heal after 8 years, because his leg was completely fucked up and shot. And I was pretty cool. That was pretty cool too. Like a little shout out to the tech that came up with by stretching out the knee and making it even again because of the lack of cartilage. I don't know if that's a real thing, but that was really cool.
Right, and you mentioned the conversation with Alfred. That might be one of the best scenes, not only in this movie, but in all three of these movies, because it has been so central. This relationship between Alfred and Batman, and in a way, I'm sad that we did not see Michael Caine basically for the rest of the movie until he gives this very powerful monologue at the end talking about failing Bruce Wayne, and he's talking directly to the gravestones of Bruce Wayne's parents. And even though Michael Caine is not in this movie a lot, he probably has two of the best scenes in the entire movie. And I think what makes that argument so effective with him and Bruce is the fact that they are both kind of right. Bruce Wayne is right about Alfred lying to him and how wrong that is, and how he's basically been doing it for 8 years. I mean, this is something that has taken a long time of build-up, and maybe if Alfred had not lied to Bruce Wayne 8 years earlier, maybe things would have been very different. So I think that that is what makes that argument so powerful, is the fact that both of these characters have been through so much with each other and externally, and there's just this moment when neither one of them can handle being around each other. Alfred cannot handle being around Bruce Wayne and Batman possibly going on a suicide mission, and Bruce Wayne cannot tolerate the fact that Alfred lied to him for all these years about the letter that Rachel Dawes sent him. And it's just a really great scene, and Michael Caine, for his last time being Alfred, he does a tremendous job.
Yeah, man, like that's probably my favorite scene in all of the trilogy, to be honest. Just them talking in the hallway and then Alfred saying goodbye. It's just fantastic, man, because you want that kind of relationship with Bruce Wayne. You want that mentor relationship because you feel like he always needs advice, right? Because he doesn't know what to do, and Alfred's always been there. And I love that relationship they had because in the '90s movies, you rarely got that. I mean, he did go to Alfred for advice, but Alfred would just kind of, give him a couple lines here and there, and that's it. And then you got that moment in Batman and Robin. But still, like, this is the best relationship that you can build between the two. It's hard. I mean, I can't believe they didn't do this in the newer movies with the Snyder and stuff, but I think they tried, but they kind of just skipped some steps. But here, because you saw the whole journey and the whole arc since they were, since he was a kid, it just pays off so well, man. It just pays off so well that when you see that gravestone, your heart breaks. You know what I mean? Because like he buried the whole family practically. You know what I mean? And he felt like he was responsible for protecting Bruce, and he failed him. And yeah, I mean, in a way, he did kind of fail him, but in a way, he didn't. Like, you know what I mean? It's just one of those things that that character has to deal with, and that moment at the end when he got that satisfaction of seeing Bruce alive at the end was pretty great too. And I totally defend that moment because both those characters deserve that.
I mentioned last week that Morgan Freeman has a little bit more to do. I don't think that's quite accurate. I think from a plot standpoint, he is much more involved, especially because there is a lack of Alfred. So I think from that perspective, Morgan Freeman does get a little bit more to do, and he's more involved with the action this time. But he really is not involved in some of the emotional aspects of things as much as Commissioner Gordon or Ed Blake or any of that. The Q scene I think is mildly amusing, but I definitely think it's the weakest of the three. Again, it's Morgan Freeman. He's perfectly acceptable, but they really don't give Fox a lot to do here. Although he does get to mention autopilot a lot.
Well, he's the one laying out all the clues, right? But even that one scene where he's doing Q again, I mean, I still got a kick out of it because it felt like it's almost as if you can't have a James Bond movie without that scene, right? And at this point, it just feels like every Nolan Batman movie needs that scene where he gets new tech and stuff because it's great. The audience loves it. You get into it, and then some. Like I said, the gadgets pay off at the end, right? And he kept mentioning autopilot. It paid off at the end.
And now we can talk about Commissioner Gordon. I think he feels so much older in this movie. Obviously, it's 8 years later, but the fact that they put some gray in his mustache and he looks haggard and tired, and part of that has to do with the fact that they sent him into the hospital, and that certainly does not help. But we kind of get the completion of Gordon's arc in that his family has left him. They have left Gotham for Cleveland. Brian, I don't know about you, but if you're leaving Gotham for Cleveland, that says a lot of very bad stuff about Gotham.
You made that joke, not me, but yeah, I thought about that exact thing too.
One of the things that I really appreciated is there's two scenes where I think Commissioner Gordon really gets to shine. And one of them is when he gets to show Ed Blake a thing or two about how to be a cop and detective. The scene when we think that Blake is going to save Commissioner Gordon in the hospital. That is such a well edited and well executed scene. It's so good. Great scoring over that because there is a moment when you think that Commissioner Gordon is actually going to die because it's the last movie. Everything is on the table as far as I'm concerned, and there was that possibility. But when Blake goes in the room and Gordon basically gives him the what for about making sure to look at the corners, that is such a great moment in this movie.
Yeah, I love the little dynamic too, and him teaching him and him, mentoring him. I love that dynamic. You know what I mean? The old cop, young cop dynamic, especially when you got a guy like Ed Blake, Joseph Gordon-Levitt. He does such a great job in this movie. He's got that same determination as Gordon. He's like a young Gordon, basically. You, he people compared him to Batman in this movie because of the parents thing, how he lost his parents as well, and how he figured out Bruce Wayne was Batman and blah blah blah. But he's more like Gordon than Batman. I think he's got more of that Gordon in him, and he's got that natural instinct to do what's right, to figure out what's going on, to ask the right questions. When you're a detective now, coincidences are, don't ignore coincidences, basically, you know what I mean? And they kind of emphasize that because he's good at his job. So that relationship I liked a lot. The way that they would interact with each other from the hospital to the ground floor to them trying to figure out where the bomb is and then getting the sentencing and all that kind of thing. It felt like that was like him handing down or passing of the torch, but he ends up rejecting the badge at the end and kind of taking over the mantle of the Batman, which is kind of cool. They mentioned Robin at the end, but I thought that whole little thing there was just great because it shows you like even though how Batman and Gordon are old and they've been doing it for 8 9 years now, Gordon even longer, but this new guard, you know what I mean? It's like this hope that keeps going and going. and it's like this new generation of hope to come for Gotham, and that's kind of like the message at the end because he's pretty much gonna be the protector of Gotham from now on. That Bruce Wayne left.
Right, and I think the essence of who Ed Blake is that he is impossibly noble, and we see just how good of a person he is trying to be. But that moment on the bridge essentially breaks him. And I even think the fact that Commissioner Gordon has this conflict about Harvey Dent, and the truth is revealed that Harvey Dent was in fact the person that murdered all of these people, and that the Dent Act was this complete and total lie. I think these are all things that slowly break Ed Blake over the course of those few months, which is when this movie takes place. And that at the end, he cannot be a police officer. He has to take on the mantle of either being Batman or Robin or Nightwing or whomever he is meant to be. And one of the things that I really appreciated about this was that he was Robin without being Robin, because there was a part of me that was questioning whether he was going to be a good guy or bad guy, whether there's going to be some sort of a twist involved with him, because there was a lot of discussion that Christopher Nolan and Christian Bale both had no interest in having Robin as a character because it would undermine the tone of this series. But then at the end of this movie, of course, we learn that his legal name is revealed to be Robin. I know that some people don't like that. I honestly did not have a problem with it necessarily, because I think it kind of works in that we're not actually going to see Robin. And if your legal name was Robin and you wanted to be a police officer, I would probably use my middle name, or I would use an alternative name as well.
Again, a realistic take, right? Because if he had a little kid, around, running around with him in this kind of world, in this realistic world, that kid would have been killed immediately, right? So I get the idea of undermining it. Although I do like the idea of a Batman and Robin movie down the line that actually is good and makes sense, and I like the crap we got in '97. But this might be, besides the Lego Batman movie, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, but this is probably the best dynamic that they had, better than Val Kilmer and Chris O'Donnell and George Clooney and Chris O'Donnell, and it was, I kind of figured it out by the end, but I didn't want to like think that, oh man, this is how they're doing Robin. But if you kind of interpret it at the end, like it's more of a sophisticated take, it's more of like an adult take. He's a young cop. He's rejecting the badge. It all makes sense, and that idea that Gordon was kind of mentoring him, from the beginning. It all kind of made sense to me.
Selena Kyle is in this movie. I think Anne Hathaway does a really good job with a character that her ultimate purpose is to get with Bruce Wayne slash Batman at the end, and that's really it. I think Anne Hathaway is someone who's taken a lot of shit for things that she doesn't deserve. I mean, when she hosted the Academy Awards and it was bad, it felt like she took a lot of the blame and James Franco took almost none of the blame. Anne Hathaway dared to actually want an Academy Award, and people were giving her crap for that. So I am here to defend Anne Hathaway, and I think as far as females go in Christopher Nolan movies, I think she does about the best job possible, because she does show actual emotion throughout all of this movie. I think from an action perspective, I think she does an excellent job. I think something that the movie does not do a good job of is making it clear that Selena Kyle is in a different class than even Bruce Wayne. I think that they hint at it in certain moments, but I don't think they really do a good job of making it clear that the reason that Selena Kyle steals is because she essentially has to, for whatever reason, and they don't really provide a lot of reasons as to why she does that. But she wants the clean slate, and that's why she betrays Batman. It's not because she's necessarily a bad person, because as we see, once the chaos starts, once the 99% take things over, so to speak, we see where her true loyalties lie. And I think it is very nuanced, but I don't think that the Selena Kyle character really got a lot of time, especially after the opening scene where we see her interact with Bruce Wayne, and the second scene in that bar, which I think is really well executed, and just the way that that scene was shot was very well done. And I only wish that Selena Kyle had got more to do.
It almost felt like she should have been in her own like kind of like villain in her own movie kind of thing, because it felt like at times they were kind of going in a direction at the beginning of the movie, and then they go off with the Bane stuff, and then you realize she's not even really a villain. But I kind of felt like if you take her out of the movie, I think it would have been the same movie. because the plot points would have been the same a little bit. Just there would be no Selena Kyle at the end to go off with and help him out. You could have had someone else do the betrayal. You know what I mean? Like it just felt like they kind of shoehorned her in, but they did the best they can with the role, and they kind of made her. They gave her some substance, and they did give her this kind of like social, like a social kind of like perspective of like classism and stuff like that. And I kind of got the message of what she was kind of going for. I think it just needed more like, in the streets and like, give her more reasoning why she steals and stuff like that. Because at the beginning, she kind of just seems like this asshole that just likes to steal stuff and just, but at the same time she's stealing it from, asshole men that deserve it at the same time. So it's like, okay, it makes sense, these misogynists that she's stealing from, and and I think they were kind of giving her this Robin Hood kind of vibe as well, how she kind of gives back a little bit. But I felt like they could have done more with her, and I kind of felt like they could have saved her for something else, but at the same time they had no other movie to do, so they kind of had to put her in this as well, because it felt like Bane was such a focus that you kind of forgot about Selena Kyle up until like the third act, because she was kind of like a big factor in the first act, not much in the second act, but the third act she kind of comes back. So that second act you kind of wanted her more.
I agree, and I think it's unfortunate that they really could not figure out how to write this character. And again, I think it speaks to kind of the weaknesses of Christopher Nolan as a screenwriter. Finally, the one person that I actively dislike in this movie, especially on the latest rewatch, was Matthew Modine. He is a cartoon character. He is a complete buffoon, and I get that that's kind of what they're going for, but he just feels like he's in a completely different movie than every other character. And the moment, especially when he decides to go after Batman instead of going after Bane, I mean, it was just ridiculous at a certain point. And when he died, I didn't feel really a whole lot of sadness because they didn't really give us a lot to invest in.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but I think they purposely wrote that character like that for some reason, just to stick out. I don't know. Maybe it was like a joke on the audience, or maybe a joke on like Hollywood itself, because like it just seems like he was in his own '80s movie, right? Like because he's such an '80s actor and all that kind of thing. But Stranger Things, being the villain in Stranger Things season one, still acting like an '80s villain. But it was just seemed so out of place. But at the same time, like I couldn't help but like smile and enjoy the weird aspects of his performance and the way it's kind of stuck out. You know what I mean? But and then him being apologetic, and then him in the car, like I'm gonna be the guy that catches Batman tonight, and there's something Gordon can never do. And I was like, oh boy, you're in for a treat. You know what I mean? He's kind of naive and a buffoon, like you said, but it added some lighthearted like tone to it in some of those serious scenes, especially in a movie like this that's filled with so much like torture on Batman and stuff like that. So I thought it was a kind of a change of pace, and it kind of did pay off a little bit, but it was more just comic relief for me, and it worked for the 2 minutes and 3 minutes stretches he was in. So
I mean, I think there were some really funny moments in this movie. Before I give my score, I'll just highlight a couple. Like when Catwoman leaves Batman alone and Batman says that line about knowing how that feels like now. I mean, that's a great payoff because it's something that Commissioner Gordon has obviously had to deal with for the last two movies. And I know some people didn't really enjoy that. I thought it was really funny that he would say that line, and I thought it worked because we all talk to ourselves sometimes. And I think the other moment that I really appreciated was the cops when they are getting ready to chase Batman for the first time, and the older cop tells the younger one that he's in for a treat, and then the younger cop is trying to use a gun, and the older cop yells at him and tells him that he's going to hurt himself, and the look that Batman gives that cop is one of the funniest things in this movie. So I definitely appreciate those moments of levity. I just think I wish the Matthew Modine character had not been written to be such a buffoon, or that the performance was better. Probably a combination of the two.
So on that note, I'm gonna go with a 9. I felt like there was a lot of strong performances all around, just like the usual. Um, it's not necessarily a 10 because the Catwoman stuff. Because like at first she just doesn't feel like a hero, but she turns out to be a hero at the end, and you just kind of wish they did more with her. But again, Christian Bale is just so amazing as the broken Bruce Wayne at the beginning of this movie that it really kind of sets the tone for the rest of the movie in terms of his performance and the way that he kind of carries himself. And he's not even that like cocky billionaire playboy that he portrays himself even in Dark Knight when he's doing the alter ego. So I thought that was a really nice subtle touch.
There's a lot of really good performances in here, and I know that I've kind of nitpicked the last couple, but I do want to emphasize that Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Gary Oldman, Christian Bale, and Michael Caine are all tremendous in this movie, especially when Gary Oldman is at the end and he's trying to put the blocker on the bomb. I think that scene is so well done, and you very much get the vibe of Commissioner Gordon is getting too old for this shit. But it's really great, and for all those reasons, I'm giving this an 8. I don't think it's as good as getting a 9 or a 10. I don't think it's historically great, but I certainly think it is Pantheon level, and for all the reasons that I just mentioned. And if you take Matthew Modine out of this movie or adapt his character and give more for Selena Kyle, I probably consider giving this a 10.
I can see that, but just something about Matthew Modine just makes me laugh because his voice, just something about his voice, you know what I mean? And also a little thing I wanted to note, I forget the actor's name, but he's standing next to Matthew Modine at the beginning of the movie. He's the congressman that gets kind of pseudo kidnapped by Catwoman. That's going to be, Thomas Wayne in the Joker movie.
Right, and he is definitely a that guy. He's been in a bunch of different things, generally playing a skeezy politician of some sort. So they have identified the perfect role for him, and that will be very interesting to see. Let's talk about the villains, of course. We have to talk about Bane. I think Tom Hardy is tremendously underrated. I think the voice stops being a distraction. I love that opening scene. I think it's almost showing off in a way what they're able to do with the airplanes and being shot in IMAX and the score going in the background. There are just so many great Bane monologues, and the way that he is able to come across as a cult leader. He's able to come across both smart and physically threatening. I think his performance in that fight scene with Batman is excellent and is as good as anything that we saw in The Dark Knight, because Bane isn't just beating up Batman, which is something that nobody else has been able to do. But he's also talking trash while he's doing it, and I think it comes across incredibly well. And I think almost everyone else in this movie, from a villain perspective, is almost superfluous. And I love Ben Mendelsohn and I love Marion Cotillard, and I'll talk about them in just a minute here. But I think what Tom Hardy is able to do with that voice and the way that he is able to get across his message, I think it comes across as very grounded and realistic in a way. I can see why people would be willing to die for this person just in the time that we see him, because of how physically imposing he is, but also the intelligence that comes with being Bane and the way that he executes his plot to destroy Gotham. I mean, in a way, he gets much closer to actually completing the deal than Ra's al Ghul did.
Yeah, and I love the whole full circle thing, like we mentioned before. He's a student of Ra's al Ghul, and basically he gets, excommunicated by the League of Shadows. As soon as Ra's al Ghul dies, he kind of comes back and kind of takes over, so we think. But that whole idea, and then the connection, and then the way he beat up, Batman was very like meticulous in particular. And then obviously breaking his back was obviously going to happen, right? But the way he just kind of like broke him down slowly but surely, and then breaking his mask at the end while he was talking that trash, it was just great. Like that's truly something we hadn't seen before in the series. Batman being physically dominated like that, and it was refreshing to see. And not only that, but you look at it in a way where he was going in like not 100%. We talked about the injuries. He goes to the doctor with a cameo by Thomas Lennon, and like basically his body's shot. Yet he's going in there against someone more like physically dangerous than ever before, than like a foe that he's ever faced. And like he's going in there way too old for this shit, and he just went in, unprepared, and it cost him. And that's one of those things that kind of shakes you up a bit, you know what I mean, and shakes the character up a bit, because Batman being broken, that's a sight to see. I mean, we've all, like the comic book fans, like they knew it was coming, but to see that for the first time on screen and having to have him rebuild himself and get out of the thing, that was great. And the way that Bane just put him through all that torture, and that monologue where he tells him, "I don't want to just kill you. I want to like torture your soul and just break you down." You know what I mean? Then you have my permission to die, and that's where that great line comes from. And just his plan, you know what I mean? And the whole 5 month plan where he's sets up the bomb and gives a 5 month, pretty much like a countdown with the reactor. So all that kind of stuff, and then the little subtle thing too, like him listening to the voice of the kid at the stadium singing the national anthem, and he goes, such a lovely voice. Just so creepy that he would even say that, you know what I mean? So all these little things just make that character great for what it is. Like I didn't know what to expect basically because when they introduced Bane, I was like, okay. And then they said Tom Hardy. I was like, oh, he was Bronson or whatever. He's big enough to do it. And then you tie in like his great intelligence to the way they're interpreting the character. It paid off really really well.
Right, and I think Ben Mendelsohn. This is the first time that I probably noticed Ben Mendelsohn. He's the mustache twirling executive Daggett. That is his function. He does a lot of yelling and blustering and all that good stuff. So that's kind of what his purpose is, and I think he's fine at it. I think Marion Cotillard is solid in her role. I think she's much better. She gets a lot more to do in Inception. But once it's clear that she's the villain, she goes batshit crazy and has a couple really good monologues. I just wish that they had done more with Miranda Tate. The problem is, again, Christopher Nolan, not great at writing female characters. So because of that, you don't really get a lot of who Miranda Tate is. We know, of course, that she is the daughter of Ra's al Ghul, and we know that she is the one that escapes the prison. But we don't really get a sense of her other purposes and kind of her motivations. And I kind of wish we had gotten a little bit more of that because I think that this film kind of needed that. With the Joker, he's obviously an agent of chaos, so you don't necessarily need to put in the work. But I think with the characters in Batman Begins, I think we did get a better sense of these folks. And I don't think we got it with Miranda Tate, and I kind of don't think we got it with Bane either.
See, the thing with Miranda Tate is I think because of the lack of like focus, it was purposeful because then the twist kind of seems out of nowhere, right? The only time we kind of really get to know her is at that fireplace after her and Bruce make love in his fucking house that has no electricity, right? And you kind of get to know her a little bit about what she says about her family, right? And then that's it. And then I think that's great because then like the more you dwell on it, the more the audience is going to like suspect things. And like a mind like mine, I didn't even suspect it because they focused less time on her background and they focused all this emphasis on Bane's background to try to convince you that Bane was, Ra's al Ghul's son, when in reality, the child that came out of hell, quote unquote, was her, right? So I thought that was a great twist because if you would have just focused more on her, then it would have been easily revealed and it would have been easily figured out, I think. But I think because they gave that much, detail to the audience, it paid off with that twist. So for me, it worked out a lot. And, the tie-in with Bane made sense, and you can kind of get the sense that Bane is in love with her, and she kind of rejects him, but she's using him kind of feeling by the end. That's kind of the vibe I'm getting. But again, that's kind of the way I guess Nolan writes his female characters. But that lack of giving details to the audience, I think, paid off with the twist.
Right, and I think your argument is convincing enough to where I'm still going to give this an 8 because of Tom Hardy, and I think Ben Mendelsohn is really good, and I think even Cillian Murphy's cameo, where he is the judge, so to speak, I think that stuff also works, and I was just really a big fan of the entire machinations of the plot, even if the plot wasn't fully well executed. I think that what they were going for here, I think the execution of it was about as good as it could be.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with an 8 as well. I just kind of feel like I don't know, Bane by the end kind of got shortchanged. Like I felt like he kind of went out. I don't know, on a weak note, but I kind of felt like at the end, Batman, him getting the upper hand and dominating him at the end of the fight, that was a good little subtle full circle thing within itself, like the story arc of him losing in the battle. So, and then him coming back and the whole sequence. I just want to mention that fight sequence when they're on the steps. Man, that was so well shot, and I think that I don't know if that was real. Like, I mean, the concrete that he broke on that thing, that was unbelievable. The way they shot that when he was punching. So I just want to mention that Tom Hardy as Bane, the way he punches is just ferocious and so realistic and brutal.
Right. And I think this brings us to the story, which I think is the weakest aspect of this entire movie, and this is where I think the flaws really shine through. And the one thing I want to point out is I don't think the flaws of this movie are noticeable on the first watch. I think you see this movie for the first time, the adrenaline's flowing, you're going through the movie, and I think it generally works. But I think when you start to really think about it, it doesn't. And I think the biggest example of this is how the hell does Bruce Wayne get from the prison to Gotham? It is almost incredible to me that this is able to happen. To our knowledge, he does not have a cell phone. He doesn't have any resources. We just don't know. And I think there is a story to be told about how Bruce Wayne got from that place to another. And I know why they didn't do it because this movie's 2 hours and 45 minutes long. I think the element of the bomb itself, the way the fission works, I'm not sure that totally works either. And I think some of the timing and the way that this is meant to take place over a number of months, I'm not sure how well some of that stuff works and how realistic the response is from the rest of the country when an American city is literally being held hostage. I'm not sure how that all works out, but I definitely think that there is some weakness here, and we go many minutes without seeing Bruce Wayne, and Alfred disappears, and there's a lot of characters disappearing in this movie, which again, because it's 2 hours and 45 minutes and we're trying to do so much, I think that things kind of get lost, and the level of detail here I don't think is as good as either the Batman Begins or the Dark Knight.
Yeah, once the city siege starts happening, that's where the timeline gets a little iffy. I think they needed like time cards or time cues for the audience, like 4 months, 3 months, and they really needed to emphasize because I didn't really pick up on this until like this viewing that there was a 5 month countdown, and it specifically says 5 months. Bane says 5 months, and the first couple times I just did not pick up on that at all. I was just like, oh my god, they're gonna like set up a nuclear bomb in the middle of Gotham, and they're gonna put it on a truck. And I was just kind of obsessed with those ideas. But the fact that it's an actual 5 month countdown, I think they really needed to emphasize that more and say that more so than the autopilot thing. Because once you get the clock in people's heads, it becomes more effective. I think the lack of knowing the timing of everything and like how long things have been going on for, and all of a sudden we're going from like 5 months to 23 days left on the clock, with everyone just kind of like looking normal, you know what I mean, still having nice hair, and everyone running out of supplies on Gotham and everything. It seems like because there's no government is bringing like the government's not bringing aid to Gotham, right? So it's just these weird little details.
Well, they did show one scene where there was aid being brought across that one bridge.
It doesn't seem like a lot though, right? It just seems like it's like breadcrumbs in comparison. You know what I mean? Like it just seems like there's a lot of lack of detail on the realism on this part, which is to me like a big criticism because we're so used to seeing realism in the Nolan trilogy of Batman movies. This is the one thing that just doesn't sit right with me, and it's just the timing of everything and the fact that he had a dislocated Batman had a dislocated vertebrae, and they didn't set it until what, a month after, and then that gives him 4 months to recover, and it gives him what, like 3 months because he has to get out of the hole and then get to Gotham. So the whole 5 month timeline thing, I think, was just a, not emphasized enough, and B, not executed well in the editing and the storytelling. So that's kind of a big weakness for me. However, there are some moments that kind of like overcome that, like when Batman gets out of the hole. Like I'm cheering, man. Everyone's chanting "Rise, rise, rise, rise," and then that moment when he jumps and catches that ledge, it's just this big cathartic moment. You know what I mean? So that does pay off. So there are elements of the script that do pay off like that, that have these great emotional moments, like the scene with Alfred and stuff like that. But the siege stuff just gets really complicated time wise, and trying to figure out what's going on. And then, like we mentioned, like how the hell does Batman get back to Gotham with his backpack?
So this is not a burning question, Brian, but imagine that you are a fan of the Rapid City football team and you decide that you are going to take your family to Gotham and you are going to enjoy this football game. And literally the entire city comes under siege while you are at this football game. That's got to be the worst day of your life, right? If you are a citizen of Rapid City and now you are stuck in Gotham for 5 months.
Not only that, I think they killed the teams, right?
I believe they did kill the team except for Hines Ward. He's the only one that lived.
Who would have thunk it? But yeah, that's one of those other things that's just like, whoa, if you're on vacation and you just went to that game like from out of town and you're stuck in the fucking city, man, nightmare.
I one of the things that I really appreciated was the visual of that scene because the kickoff is such a common play, and of course that is Pittsburgh Steelers former Pittsburgh Steeler Hines Ward was the one who got to do it, and I almost wish, and again he's not an actual actor, but I would have loved to have seen some sort of a reaction from him turning around and seeing like what the hell just happened. And if there was a way to capture that, I think it would have only added to the movie. Instead, he just kind of turns around and just looks, and we don't get any sense of like this mass chaos that has just ensued. That's a really minor note, though.
Well, that just could be his performance in general because he's a football player or ex-football player. Hey, not everyone can be Michael Strahan, man.
Absolutely not. So there are a couple things about the ending. One of the lines that is said in The Dark Knight by Harvey Dent is that it is always darkest before the dawn. And fittingly, when does the final battle take place? When Batman and Bane are on the steps. When does this take place, Brian?
The Dawn.
So it only makes sense that this does take place at the dawn, and just like so many MCU movies take place during the daytime. I think it's funny, of course it is because of that line, I'm sure, that the dawn plays such an important role in this, but I think it's really interesting that all of this final battle takes place during the daytime, whereas Act 3 of the Batman Begins and The Dark Knight takes place at night. And I believe every Batman movie up to this point, the final kind of act had taken place at night. And there have been some conspiracy theories about the end of the movie and how ambiguous is it supposed to be. I think some of this is because of Christopher Nolan himself. But while some took it at face value that Bruce had survived and Alfred really saw him, others thought that Bruce was dead and saw the cafe scene as a non-literal fantasy nod to Alfred's stated wish from earlier in the movie that Bruce might be able to someday find peace and a normal life. In a December 2012 interview with the Los Angeles Times, Michael Caine seemed to settle the question when he said that Bruce was supposed to be unambiguously alive during the scene. They were there when he said that Bruce was supposed to be, or they were real, there was no imagination, they were real, and he was with Anne Hathaway, the cat lady, and I was happy ever after for them, as they told him during the picture. The shooting script also specifies that Bruce is alive during the cafe scene. A line of spoken dialogue towards the end of the movie also notes that Martha Wayne's pearls are missing from the Wayne estate, and in the final scene, Selina is wearing the necklace. So for anyone who is a conspiracy theorist, that is Bruce Wayne and Selina Kyle. They are both alive at the end.
Again, I'm going to bring up Inception because I kind of think this is Inception's fault because of the whole ambiguous ending with the spinning top, even though it's clearly him because he's wearing his ring. Or wait, no, he's or something to do with the ring. I forget about that part, but it's something to do with his ring with Leonardo DiCaprio. In this case, it's clear as day, and I think because of the whole Inception interpreted, open ending thing that they wanted to do it here, and it's really literally literal. And I can tell you that just by the way that Alfred looks, because no human being would look that way and react that way to a person that wasn't even there unless they're crazy, right? Or schizophrenic or something like that. We know Alfred's not schizophrenic, so he's reacting to someone that's actually there. If Bruce wasn't even there, he wouldn't have reacted that way.
All right, so I think the story is a very mixed bag. I am giving this a 6.
I'm going to go with a 7. I was going to go with a 6, but that moment where he jumps the ledge kind of put my score up because, like, that is a great emotional, cathartic moment, like I said. So that does pay off really well, and that kind of helped the score a little bit. 7 out of 10, though. In comparison, my previous two scores were 10s out of 10s on both Begins and Dark Knight, so that kind of tells you like a 3-point drop off. Still is a lot.
Right. I think the story is a significant issue, but I think what makes up for the story, I think the editing actually does a spectacular job of hiding some of the story problems, which are significant and which do deserve to be mentioned. In some cases, I think the technical aspects of this movie are even more impressive and ambitious than The Dark Knight because, again, a lot of this movie is shot during the day. They're shooting in multiple cities. You've got the first stock market scene, which we really have not talked about. The execution of that. The score, the fact that Catwoman and Bane have such specific music for them, and I think it works out so well. The fact that that prison is so beautifully rendered, I think it looks great. I think the final sequence, especially the chase sequence, everyone talks about the chase sequence in the middle of The Dark Knight, but I think the chase sequence in this movie is as good as is as dramatic because of the stakes that are involved, because there is a literal nuclear bomb that is potentially going to blow up. I love the technical aspects of the scene where Edward tries to save Commissioner Gordon, And again, I think that score, it just sounds so different from the first two movies. And even though this movie is just about 3 hours long, 2 hours and 45 minutes, I think that this is so well paced and you don't even notice the time. I think there are certainly some issues with the story part of it, but I did not have those with the technical part. And for that, I'm also giving this, just as I did The Dark Knight, a perfect 10.
I'm gonna go with a nine, just because like I felt like I think they obviously use more CGI in this movie, but I was just so used to the Dark Knight where they had the lack of CGI, and I even felt like Batman Begins uses more CGI than Dark Knight does, and that lack of that I just enjoyed so much in Dark Knight, I kind of wanted more here. But then when I see that sequence where they're at the football field, and you see them blowing up the field, it's clearly like that's a CGI thing, and it just didn't sit right with me. It didn't seem like a natural thing. Like all the other explosions going on around it were clearly like real and natural, but for some reason. That field scene still doesn't sit right with me the way it looks. I don't know if you mentioned it because it was the performance reaction from Heinz Ward or whatever, or just the way it looked, but it just doesn't. It didn't feel right with me. I do love everything being shot in the daytime in this movie, pretty much, except for a few scenes at the beginning of the first act. But I do love the emphasis of shooting in the daytime and seeing Bane in the daytime giving a speech, and then the main sequence at the end having it in the daytime. I'm gonna go with a nine just because I feel like some of the CGI was not as I didn't like it as much. But that's just kind of like selective things, and I kind of felt like that the score was really good, but it just I don't know. It is unique and all with the Catwoman theme, with the piano and the Bane's theme, but everything else kind of just seemed too like rehashed. And I hate to say that about Hans Zimmer, but it just felt like the Batman theme kind of kept being reused and reused. And I know you're supposed to do that in music, but I felt like they could have had some new twist to the theme a little bit, but they didn't really do that with Batman's theme.
All right, the legacy of this movie, I think in some cases, I think it's been unfairly maligned as the least of the three movies. But you look at the IMDb score, which isn't always accurate and isn't always fair, but it's still really high. The Rotten Tomatoes score is high. The box office for this movie is really good. I think this stands as a complete trilogy that will likely never be touched again, and I think this is a definitive conclusion, and I think it deserves a ton of credit for that. I think it stands alone as an individual story, and although it is not as good as Batman Begins or The Dark Knight, I think it is one of the best conclusions to a trilogy that you'll ever see. And unlike so many of the other movies where I think you have that rule of three where the third one is the weakest, this one might be the weakest, but that's like saying Return of the Jedi is not as good as The Empire Strikes Back and A New Hope. I still think Return of the Jedi is still really, really good. I still think this movie is really, really good, even if it is a step down from the first two. For those reasons, my legacy score is an 8.
I'm gonna go with an eight as well, and to me, it's more about the consistency and quality because you rarely get that in film franchises, right? Despite how you feel about Godfather Part Three and certain aspects of that movie, I still feel like it's a good movie on its own, like as a whole. So there's consistency there. I feel like you get that consistency in Toy Story. Some other trilogies, not so much. You know what I mean? Like obviously Spider-Man, something like that. To be able to hold that for all three movies and keep the same director, I think that adds to the legacy as well. So it's an 8 out of 10. It's nothing monumental like Dark Knight where it completely changed the game, but it was a great way to satisfy the fans in the ending of the series.
My total score is a 40, and yours is?
41.
So, this movie has received an 81. It is 17 points lower than The Dark Knight, which was, of course, our highest rated, but still good enough to get into the superhero pantheon. This makes this the first complete franchise to make our superhero pantheon. This is also the fourth movie in a row that we've put in the pantheon and the fourth Batman movie to go into the superhero pantheon. And I don't think this streak is going to hold for very much longer, but it is really impressive to me that all three of these movies are good enough to get into the pantheon. I think it speaks to Christopher Nolan and Christian Bale and all of the individual actors who played the villains. It is a testament to how good this particular trilogy is at standing on its own. And just for the technical aspects alone, I think this franchise really was a trendsetter. And it's probably going to be, it's one of those franchises that I think has set up other movies in good ways and in bad. And I think in a lot of ways, because of the lack of CGI, it's probably going to remain one of the best looking trilogies for a long, long time.
Totally, and it deserves it. And unfortunately, it's going to go all downhill from here. But to be honest, I didn't know if Dark Knight Rises was going to be a shoe-in or not. It was very much on the fence for me. And upon this recent viewing, like I really didn't realize how much I loved this movie in terms of like the relationship between Alfred and Batman, and that coming full circle, and the stuff with Gordon, and the Blake character. I never realized how much I liked the Blake character in this movie until now. Like he's truly the young Gordon, and I never picked up on until now.
Right, and this was also something that I really did not know if this was going to go in. I felt really confident about Batman Begins. Dark Knight was a shoe-in. If that did not go in, I was going to quit the podcast. But this one I wasn't sure, and I agree with you that this is definitely not on the higher end of Pantheon movies, but I certainly think it deserves to go in. With all that being said, let's get to the burning questions. Was the Miranda Tate twist effective?
Yes, and I hate to toot my own horn, but I usually see these heel turns in movies coming. And this is one of the few in like the last 10 years where I just didn't see it coming, and I don't know what that says about me, but I think it was because, like I mentioned earlier, the lack of too much detail in her character just set it up perfectly. Because if you emphasize her more and more and more, it's going to be clear and obvious that she's the bad guy. But because they picked their spots and only gave her that brief, sentence or two about her parents with Bruce Wayne at the fireplace, it set it up for a perfect turn, and I think it was great.
I don't know. I guess I did see it coming, and I almost wonder if that is affecting my answer here. I'm not sure if it was totally effective. I don't know. There was just something about the moment that they actually slept together where I was like, oh, she's totally turning on him at the end. And I guess because that is a trope or a cliche that is often used in movies. And I don't know. I don't think that it was totally effective for me, and I wish that it could have been better. How could the Joker have possibly fit into this movie? I know that you mentioned him possibly taking over the Scarecrow role, but I have a really hard time picturing him actually being in this version of The Dark Knight Rises. And I have a feeling that if the Joker had been in this movie, if Heath Ledger had unfortunately not passed, that the story would have seen some significant differences.
Yeah, I think that he either would have been in the Scarecrow role, or, they break people out of Arkham too in this movie in prison, so he could have been one of those people broken out, and you could have seen him do some crazy stuff. Or you could have actually seen him just, you see the criminals don't want to break him out because they know he's so crazy that it'll be even more chaotic, so maybe they purposely don't break him out. So I also kind of pictured the scene in my head where they walk by his cell and they're about to unlock his cell, and then Bane comes in and says, no, leave him, or something like that, so to add more to the character.
Why does this film not get the credit that it deserves like the first two?
I don't know if it's the rule of three, like you mentioned, or the Dark Knight is just such a high, pillar. You know what I mean? It's just hard to compare, but at the same time, it's like people forget. You know what I mean? So it sucks because it's hard to compare the two because they're good on their own ways, and Dark Knight is just way superior. So it's almost like comparing 11 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10. You know what I mean? So that's kind of the way it is, and it's unfortunate. It's like people forget, you know what I mean? Like when a new wrestler comes in, kind of thing, and like the old wrestler was so good, and you have to compare him, and then you realize it's not nearly as good as the wrestler that was before him, kind of thing. That's the way Hollywood is in general with actors and stuff like that as well.
I can certainly understand that. Where does Christian Bale rank in terms of Batman's? And for me, I think he's right up there with Michael Keaton as possibly being the best. I wish that Michael Keaton had as much character work as Christian Bale. I think I would have been even more inclined to say Michael Keaton is the definitive number one. But I would definitely rank Christian Bale up way above Ben Affleck and Val Kilmer and George Clooney. And I definitely put him with Kevin Conroy and Adam West and Michael Keaton in terms of kind of being the Mount Rushmore of Batmans, I guess.
I want to say he's the overall number one. Like, he's definitely the best Batman. The best Bruce Wayne, I'm not sure. Like, he's maybe it. You mentioned Adam West because, like, Adam West as Bruce Wayne is fantastic as well. So it's hard to say. Like, I always kind of break that comparison. Like, I always compare my Batmans as, like, he's a good Bruce Wayne, or is he a good Batman, or are they both? Like, to be both, that's tough to do. So he's really good at being Bruce Wayne, almost excellent at times, excellent as Batman. So it's hard to say. because he's definitely the best Batman in terms of the best Bruce Wayne. It's hard to say because I love Adam West.
What is the legacy of Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy?
That's tough, man. I've been thinking about this, and its overall legacy is going to be like this is how a great superhero movie is made, and unfortunately, let's try to redo that and copy it and try to make our own, and then that's where the bad lessons come from. But the good lessons should be like character development, taking things seriously, treating your character seriously, casting, the right actor for the right role, all that kind of thing, and those are the right lessons to take from it, and not just the box office success, but just timing is also a factor in this as well. I mean, they got this trilogy done in less than 10 years. To do that, to do this in less than 10 years, along with Inception and The Prestige, I think that says a lot about Nolan's career in a 10-year span right there. So his legacy is, cemented. I think to me, he's like not necessarily untouchable, but he could have retired after this and just been like, I'm done, Nolan, and everyone would respect him for it because he would have left a great legacy.
I mean, if you look at from 2005 to 2015, this is the output that you get from Christopher Nolan. You get Batman Begins, The Prestige, The Dark Knight, Inception, The Dark Knight Rises, and Interstellar. That is a hell of a 10 years, and I think you almost have to connect all of those movies with these three movies as well, in that this is one of the best runs of a decade that a director has probably ever had. And while I don't think The Dark Knight Rises is as good as the first two movies, I think that this entire trilogy taken as a whole is a model for other superhero franchises to consider, in that it is not about being dark, but it is about creating grounded characters. And I almost wonder if it is impossible to do this with any other character besides Batman, because with Superman, he has powers. With the X-Men or with the Marvel characters, they have powers. So it's so difficult to do these grounded stories. I think Netflix was kind of a mixed success with Daredevil and doing some of these more grounded stories, and I think with better production values, I think they could have gotten that across. But Batman, I think, is uniquely suited to be able to have these kinds of stories being told and still also kind of cross into the fantastical with some of the cosmic stories when Batman goes into the space and he's in the Justice League. I think those things still work, but ultimately, I think that for the story that Nolan was trying to tell, this grounded Batman story, it is complete, it is finished, and hopefully it will never be touched again, because there's no way he's ever going to be able to top himself.
It's funny because like I remember leaving the theater and just kind of wanting, oh man, do I really want a Nightwing movie right now by Christopher Nolan? Do I want that? Thinking that it was going to happen possibly, and just thinking like, no, that's not going to happen. It's a trilogy. But I couldn't help but think of that. But maybe one day, 20 years from now, if he gets inspired and Christian Bale, wants to do something ambitious, maybe they can do The Dark Knight Returns, right? And do the modern interpretation of that.
I really hope that doesn't happen. I really just want this to be left alone.
You never know in 20 years, man. Because I never thought we would get a new Star Wars movie, and then Disney just went in and bought everything. So things can change. But for right now, we're safe. For right now, we're safe.
I think with Star Wars, you get to create new characters, and we could probably have a whole conversation about the ramifications of Disney buying Star Wars. But I really just want to leave this alone, as if at all possible. But we are not leaving Batman alone. We still have four more Batman related movies to get into, three of which are not going to be fun to talk about, one of which is, and as kind of a palate cleanser between franchises, just like we did with Batman Mask of the Phantasm, we're going to go a little bit out of order, and next week we are going to talk about Lego Batman, which stars Will Arnett, and is kind of a spin-off of the Lego movie that came out in 2014. All I can say, folks, is this movie is very meta, and we will be getting into why it's so meta and how much it actually works. So next week, Brian, we're talking about Lego Batman. Any opening thoughts?
Definitely my favorite Batman and Robin movie, if that makes sense. The dynamic they got in there just gets to the heart of the real relationship with the two, and it's amazing that a freaking Lego movie was able to pull that off and not a real live action movie with grounded characters.
All right, so that is for next week. For Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening this week. We will talk to you again next week.
Nobody has my permission to die.